I have in the middle there about the life of Paul. What we know is he was probably born around 6 BC, so roughly the same time as Jesus. Jesus was presumably born in 6 BC. And he probably died in 67. I say probably because we really don't know any definite dates about it. At the end, when I come there, I ask you, so what do you know when you know all this? A bunch of useless dates. I'm not minimizing it. I'm simply saying to know when he was born and know when he died is adequate. At least you know what century he's in, and you have some idea of what time period it is. But it still is important to us not to lose this historical sense, so that the next piece of information is we want to talk about Paul's 7 undisputed letters. Now, perhaps this is new to you. How many letters of Paul are in the New Testament? How many letters attributed to Paul? Do you know? Did you ever study? 14. 14. If you look in your Bible, the letters of Paul were there collected starting with Romans and ending with Hebrews, and you count them, there are 14. How are those letters arranged? Do you ever look at that? Pardon? By length partially, but primarily how? First, all the letters written to groups. Romans, Corinthians, Galatians. Okay, these are groups. And then to individuals, Philemon, and so on, to individuals. So the first division of those letters is quite arbitrary, isn't it? Put them all, those sent to groups, and then all those sent to individuals. Then how are those two clusters arranged? By length, from the longest to the shortest. So that's hardly a way to get to know anybody, to read their writings from longest to shortest or make this kind of arbitrary arrangement. So what scholars have done is looked at these 14 letters, and over the centuries, at least the last 2 or 3 centuries, have concluded, these are good general conclusions. First of all, Hebrews is not a letter. If you look at it, it's very clear it's not a letter, it's an essay. It's theological reflection. So as far as I know, hardly anybody in the world recognizes that Paul wrote that letter. Hardly anybody. They say, no, that came much after Paul's time. It's a theological reflection. It's not his letter. Now that leaves 13. Of those 13 letters, 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus really jar, they clash with the other letters when you start looking at the structure of the community. 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus is speaking about highly organized communities. People got statuses and roles and things like that. Not to mention different vocabulary and different perspective, where those letters are also considered after Paul's. Paul's dead when these are written. Somebody wrote them in his name. So 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus, I usually call the pastoral letters because the person who wrote them in Paul's name has been dubbed the pastor. He's behaving like a pastor. These are communities he founded, he's concerned about, he's interested in them, and he doesn't dare write in his own name, Shmuel, whatever it was, so he writes in the name of Paul so that the letters would be accepted. Now that leaves us 10. Of those 10, there are 3 that are hotly debated: 2 Thessalonians, Ephesians, and Colossians. 2 Thessalonians, Ephesians, and Colossians. And so which are these? 2nd generation Pauline documents. It won't tell us about Paul, it'll tell us about 2nd generation. And then Hebrews, Ephesians, and the pastoral letters are 3rd generation documents. Now let me toss something else in here from immigration studies. When I was in the Philippines, one of the most fascinating groups I palled around with were the Scalabrinis. I don't know if you know any Scalabrini fathers, but they specialize in migration all around the world. Their whole ministry is with migrants, and they have some stupendous centers for studying migration patterns in the world. Really good stuff. So out of these kinds of studies, what we find out is the 1st generation has an experience, and very often the 1st generation, like 1st generation in my family in Poland, my grandparents, had to flee Poland and so on under difficult circumstances. You can resonate with that. The second generation usually tries hard to forget what the first generation is all about. And so very often you may have in your own experiences second generation people who don't teach the kids Polish, don't want them to know anything about it, just become American, just melt into the whole situation. And then what's the third generation try to do? They try to get back to what the first generation was all about. So Jesus was the first generation with his followers. And the Pauline letters in general are the second generation. Do you ever notice how little they say about Jesus? If you're looking for information about Jesus, it's not in the letters. It's all about God and about Israel and Israelite traditions. And then what are the third generation documents? The Gospels. Yes, the Gospel writers want to get back to what the first generation was all about. So this is another way of looking at these writings to try to make some kind of sense of it and why they differ as they do. So we put those aside, and that leaves us with 7. So scientific scholars will usually use these 7 that I have here on your handouts, I'll read them in a moment, as undisputed. Nobody argues about this. Once you get beyond this, then you get into arguments and differences, and if you're going to be, it's hardly worth pursuing anything if you're going to be arguing with others as whether or not Paul wrote the letter. Forget about it. Let's agree. Let's look at what we agree he wrote. So the earliest letter is to Thessalonians. That's in northern Greece, Thessalonica. The next letter probably was Galatians. The next one is Philippians. Then 1 Corinthians, then 2 Corinthians, then Romans and Philemon. So, and I have on your handouts the respective dates. You notice that you can't be precise with those dates. There's a big spread. With 2 Corinthians, you notice there are 2 letters. There may have been 4 that somehow got combined and lost and that it's really a mess. But these are the 7 letters that we can focus on and make some kind of agreement about. And these are the letters that Bruce and I are writing our commentary about. So here's how we look at these letters. 5 of these letters, 5 of them, deal with problems. Romans, and this is going to be a surprise perhaps to many of you, is not a doctrinal letter at all. It's travel arrangements. Paul is like writing to his travel agent saying, I want to make this trip, and here's what I got in common with you. So it's going to be a good visit, because this is what we agree on. So, okay, make sure you get the hotel, to get the tickets and everything. It's a travel arrangements letter. It isn't this great big, and Protestants make a big issue of it. All major Protestant commentators have written a massive commentary on Romans. It's simply not there. And then Philemon is a letter of recommendation. The runaway slave who ran to Paul, Paul sends him back with this letter saying, please take this guy back and don't punish him. He's an okay guy, he became a believer, and so on and so on. So that's another way of looking at these letters. These are first generation documents tracing back to Paul. They originated with Paul and his interaction with persons in the churches that he founded. Okay, are you still with me? 2 things then before we move ahead to Paul's life is the reason why we need historical perspective is to avoid anachronism. Okay, now, in other words, you know very simply that if we said that when Herod went out to persecute and to kill all those babies, Joseph and Mary jumped in the SUV and filled it with gas and went on their way. You say, well, that's anachronistic. But in reading our Bible, sometimes we make similar anachronistic interpretations, often under the stimulus of theology. Often the theology is the culprit. Or spirituality is the other one, trying to make sense out of a difficult situation. And the second one is ethnocentrism. They're just like us. They're just like us. My colleague Bruce was giving lectures in Italy and presenting all this Mediterranean insight, which the Italians should certainly recognize as their own. I mean, this is how they live and do it all the time. And after he finished his lecture, they said, "What you said is true. But this book is about holy people, and it's a holy book, and that doesn't count." They just completely denied it. They just went in a whole different track. So no, we need to pay attention to history, and we need to pay attention to the specific cultural setting.